Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Joanna Lalikas. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Botanical Garden, and we're really excited to have another Lunchbox talk and have you all joining us here and on Zoom. Looking forward to hearing from Dr. Joel Kingsolver on climate change and biodiversity. In the back of the room, we have David Michaud, who's supporting our Zoom audience, and he'll share questions from that audience with our speaker today. So Joel said he'd be happy to take any clarifying questions during his talk and also take questions at the end. Joel Kingsolver was educated at St. Camillus Elementary, Thomas Johnson High, Duke, Wisconsin, Stanford, and UC Berkeley, and held faculty positions at Brown University and University of Washington before moving to Chapel Hill and UNC in 2001. Over the years, his research has involved biomechanics, environmental biophysics, physiology, ecology, and evolution. But his current areas of focus include evolutionary and physiological ecology and population biology, mostly with insects and insect-plant interactions. He has a long-standing interest in educational software and more recently in communicating science to non-science audiences. In his spare time, Joel likes to hike and play guitar and sometimes write songs about biology. Maybe we can bring you to sing some of those songs another time. So please join me in welcoming Joel Kingsolver.
Thanks all for coming today. The introduction came from my website, and it helps remind me most of what I learned about writing. I came from St. Camillus Elementary School, so I don't know if any of you share that kind of background or not, but it was important to my career. So I want to mostly talk about climate change today, but I wanted to start with a graph. So I'm a scientist. I love data and graphics and things like that, so please indulge me some. But this is from a paper just a couple of months ago. I think it's a wonderful illustration of how humans dominate the world, okay? And so the basic idea here is if we took all the humans in the world and we weighed them, we would have the total biomass of humans on the planet, okay? And then we could do that for cattle and elephants and mice and everything else. So this is one way to view mammal diversity on life right now, on Earth right now. And this little diagram, the different areas represent how much of so the total biomass is, there are 1 billion metric tons of mammals on Earth currently. That's a lot, okay. This is humans. This is domesticated animals. Here's wild marine mammals. I'm sorry, this is all for mammals, just for mammals, okay. And here are wild terrestrial mammals, okay. And you can see at a glance, there's humans and domesticated mammals, and then there's these little bits over here, okay. And in fact, if you kind of look at it in terms of numbers, less than 6% of the total mammal biomass on Earth is wild, and less than 2% on land is wild, okay? 10,000 years ago, this would have been completely reversed. I mean, there were some humans, we had some cattle and sheep and things. There were more cattle than human biomass, okay? That surprised me, and it's kind of scary, okay? And actually, of the wild land mammals, 10% are white-tailed deer, okay? We know we have a lot of them around here, but that's pretty striking. So only 90% of the 2% of land mammals are not wild-tailed deer or something that we have put here, okay? So that's one way of thinking about how humans, the magnitude of our impacts on life on Earth. That's one sort of framework for that. And I love this graphic. It's my favorite new graphic. So, but obviously this is just illustrating one of the many ways we've impacted life on Earth and biodiversity, which is the topic today. And so today I want to talk a little bit about climate change and how that is causing plants and animals to respond and how we make predictions about those responses in the future. and potentially what we might do about that, okay? And so let me start by just talking briefly about, everybody knows about climate change. I mean, so you probably wouldn't have come if you weren't interested and knew at least a little bit about it, okay? But I want to give just a few basic points. One is we have amazing climate records, very detailed climate records that come from these ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica primarily, that date back several million years now. We have super fine scale records. And they give us indicators not only of temperature, but also of the greenhouse and other gases and little air bubbles within the ice. So we can measure those directly, okay? And so most of what we know about, when I say recent, I mean recent geological, the past few million years, climate change comes from these sorts of records. There's lots of other kinds of data as well, okay? And one of the key findings from those sorts of studies is changes in variation in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So this blue line here, this is thousands of years ago, so that's 400,000 years ago. These are the cycles of atmospheric CO2 over time, okay, over this 400,000 year period, okay? And I'm not showing it here, but every time there's a big drop in CO2, there's an ice age. And every time it goes back up, temperature warms back up. So these are the ice age cycles that we've seen, okay? And here, 18,000 years ago was the peak of the last, most recent ice age. And this is the increase in atmospheric CO2 since then, in that last 18,000 years, okay? And one thing I'll just point out is you can see it's going bouncing around, but it's kind of bouncing around. This is like 200 to 300. Forget about the units for a minute, okay? And then there's this little bit here where it zooms off in the last couple of centuries. And last month it's 423, okay? Parts per billion, parts per million, sorry. And so it's higher than anything here, okay? And in fact, it's higher than anything in at least the last 4 million years. So there's natural variation in CO2 and other greenhouse gases. There's natural variation in temperature. We're off the map during the, basically the history of humans since we, became a species, okay? And so when we're talking about climate change now, of course, we're interested in this last little bit that's happened in the recent decades in the last century, okay? And the physics of this is very well understood. Greenhouse gases have certain physical effects that lead to change. So every time CO2 goes up, global mean temperature goes up. There's lots of other things that cause a little variability, but this has been understood for many decades, okay? Let's think about the last 50 years or so. I mean, I see, I actually started studying climate change in about 1990. I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes, okay? But these are data from over 50 years, the second half of the 20th century, okay? And so this is a world map, and so we can see here we are right there. This is a measure of the change in the mean annual temperature. So it's the global average temperature over this 50-year period. And yellows and oranges and reds, those are all temperature increases. And you can see at a glance, most of it's in the orange and red range. So we've seen overall climate increases. And that's particularly true at the highest latitudes, okay? So this is recent change over these last few decades or so, okay? And you can also see, interestingly, that we have here in the Southeast, there has been climate change in this time period, but it's actually smaller than a lot of other areas, okay? And also the regional variation is something that's still of a lot of scientific interest, what causes that. And just as we could talk for many, many hours about these sorts of data, but this is a slide I put together based on climate events from last summer, because you all probably remember, in many areas in the Southwest and in the West, we had large-scale drought occurred. We had these very extreme heat waves in Europe. This is a map of basically new high temperature records that occurred across the US. And again, most of those are, here in the Western half of the country. We did relatively okay compared to that. It's all relative. Okay. And so we see both these increases in average temperatures globally. We see a lot of regional variation. We see increases in extremes. And in fact, this is just a quick list. I won't even read them all of the kinds of changes that have happened in the last 50 years or so in terms of mean changes, extreme temperatures, what's happening in the seas, what's happening at the poles, all the ocean acidification. Here's two things: heavy precipitation events, wildfires. I put this little star here because everything above here were all predictions made in something called the IPCC in 1990. Does anybody know what the IPCC is? Yeah, do you remember what it stands for? Yeah, that's great. Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Okay, it's a group. It's literally thousands of scientists who have come together. Starting, actually, the first report was in 1990. Okay, to sort of assess and make predictions with different levels of confidence about what we were expecting, what we were seeing then. In 1990, it was a question: climate was changing. How much are humans actually contributing to that? They made a bunch of predictions that if humans are contributing, these are the things we ought to see with high confidence, and they were right on the mark in every single one. So that was science 30 years ago. Okay, that was already known at that point. And it's actually played out and in fact been more extreme and of greater magnitude than was predicted, than we had feared. Okay. So that first, and actually that's when I first started working on this topic, because I thought this is really interesting and important, and I learned more about that. Okay. If only it was just, well, no, I shouldn't say that. We've learned a lot scientifically, and that's the part that I actually have some expertise in. Last year was the 6th report from the IPCC, which is an assessment of, if you remember two things from my talk today, remember that first graph, and remember IPCC is an enormous resource for learning anything about climate predictions, impacts, all kinds of things like that. And they have this nice thing where they have summary for policymakers, and which were written for a non-technical audience, and there are basically bullet point lists for policymakers. I mean, I'm very confident any of you can understand way more than most policymakers can make. So this is for you all. And then there's much more detailed full reports and technical summaries and all that kind of stuff. It's actually a wonderful resource. So check it out if you want to learn anything more about any of this stuff. Okay. But one of the things that they do in that report and is ask, okay, let's look at CO2 is increasing. It has been increasing. Okay. What if we intervene? So what they do is they come up with what they call scenarios, or, sorry, there will be lots of acronyms and I'll try to spell them out, but they call them representative concentration pathways. What that really means is if we just keep doing what we're doing now, and we don't change anything about our policy or climate or energy use or the like, that's often called the business as usual model. This is what we'll have here. We are here, okay? This is what the atmospheric CO2 equivalents are gonna do if we just keep doing what we're doing, okay? And then there's a bunch of other scenarios where we have reduced emissions, and I'm actually gonna focus on this. This is like the worst, probably the worst case scenario in terms of climate. And this is actually similar to the Paris Agreement, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, like what's involved in that. These are if we actively intervene in emissions and other sorts of aspects of this scenario, how can we limit the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere? So we have a choice about this. This is what we can actually do. Okay. I'll return to that later. Okay. This is the world at the end of the century in the business as usual scenario. So this is the increase in temperature from, in pre-industrial standards as a result of human-induced climate change. And once again, you see the worst impacts are at the poles, and we understand that physically quite well. Okay, but this is 7, 8 degrees, and these are centigrade. So one way to think about 5 degrees centigrade is 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so going up by 10 degrees, that's hard to imagine. But that's the predictions from these models in the business as usual scenario. That's bad. Okay, all right. And I'll just mention, there's a lot of different elements of that in terms of average temperature. This is the global the mean sea level rise. We don't have to look at these in detail, but if we compare basically a moderate scenario that we're, through the Paris Agreement with business as usual, this is the difference in temperature, in sea level rise, and by business as usual, there will be no sea ice in about 30 at the north, around the North Pole. This is global ocean acidification. Okay, so those are the kinds of predictions that are made in this IPCC report. Okay. And this is just a different version of what an ice-free Arctic will be like, certainly with most of these scenarios in the next 50 years or so. Okay. All right, one more complicated, I've taken a lot of these graphs from IPCC. They're wonderful graphs. You could spend like 10 minutes on each one. I know I'm going through them fast, but I want to give you some background. Because I want to actually start talking about plants and animals and that kind of stuff, not the climate side. Okay. But this is a really nice summary graph that here we are, 2023. These are these different projections. Here's a relatively aggressive scenario of climate control. Here's business as usual. And what they've done is they've gone through and say, well, given where we are on these different curves, how likely are we to have increased extreme weather events, various other sorts of things? What I want to focus on today is this component here is, how is this threatening biological systems? Okay. And you can see, well, we're kind of here, and those are colors where, yeah, there's some moderate impacts, but we're not way up here yet. Okay, so that's kind of a snapshot of where we are now in terms of climate change predictions about the future, and now moving into, well, what's that going to do in terms of plants and animals? So what I want to do is to really talk about 3 different aspects and to basically touch on them. Okay, one is, well, climate's already been changing, so how have things already responded? Okay, what have we learned from that? Okay, a second is, how can we use that information to make predictions in the future? And where do these predictions come from? And I want to give you a sense for, the motivation behind those predictions. Okay. And then a key question is, well, the outcome of climate change is not going to be that all of life disappears. Okay, maybe other things would cause all of life to disappear, but it's not going to be climate change. But there will clearly be some species that are more successful, others that will be less successful and disappear. Okay, so who are those and why are they going to have those sorts of outcomes? Okay. So a really key idea in this area is called a climate niche. And you've probably all heard of the idea of an ecological niche, basically sets of environments that an organism could exist in, okay? And one nice way to think about this in terms of climate niche is what's the range of temperature and precipitation conditions in which a particular species can occur, okay, can exist. And this differs very dramatically if you look across the globe at different species. So we can think about these colored points here as a bunch of different points. This is actually in Scandinavia, okay? Locations that have different combinations of relatively higher temperatures and lower annual precipitation to relatively low temperatures. And well, it's actually not, most of the places that have lower temperatures have relatively low precipitation, okay? And this is the range of conditions that Norway spruce, a tree that's very important in the boreal forests, okay, can exist, okay? Physiologically, it's adapted to that set of conditions. And you can see it's adapted to cold conditions and actually relatively dry conditions. This is only 10 degrees centigrade. That's like, 50 degrees or something like that, right? Okay, so that's pretty chilly, okay? Of course, as climate change is happening, that means, in any particular area, across the landscape, these temperatures are becoming more common. These temperatures are becoming less common. These places will disappear, and these will, am I doing it the wrong way? Yeah, will disappear. And that's going to cause, well, two things will happen. Either Norway spruce will disappear in a region, or its range will shift to someplace else. Okay? But the idea of a climate niche is this is a set of conditions where a species can occur. If those conditions change in their location, well, what can that species do? And the possibilities are it could move over space. And for some species, they can move over time. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Or they can evolve to be adapted to those new conditions, or they can go extinct. Those are four possibilities in terms of what the response is. Okay. So the nice thing about this is that it gives us a quantitative way of saying, here's where a species can live. We can do that for any species, okay? And then ask, as the environment is changing, as climate is changing, can that species still exist in that particular region, or where can it exist? So most predictions about climate change start with this idea of a climate niche, okay? So that's Norway spruce. Here's another non-random example, which is humans. We can do the same thing for humans. Where do humans exist on Earth? Okay. Now the axes are flipped, but this is the average yearly temperature, and this is the average yearly precipitation. Okay. And the dark here is areas where humans don't occur, and the brighter colors in the red are where they occur. And this is humans now. This is the range of temperatures and precipitations where humans occur. Here's actually estimates from 6,000 years ago. It hasn't really changed that much. I mean, humans are pretty much the same as we used to be. There's some, you can see there's some subtle differences, okay? And if you think about all the places on Earth that have different conditions, there's actually a lot of places that are colder and drier. There's not that many people in northern Siberia. There aren't people in Antarctica, for example, permanent settlements. And there's also no human population sustained above an annual temperature of 29 centigrade. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We'll come back to it. That's the climate niche for humans. So let me talk, I've mentioned this already, but let's talk about, okay, we have a species, it can occur in a particular area. Climate is changing, what can it do? Okay. I've already mentioned this idea of changes in geographic range. So let me illustrate that. Lots of species have life cycles that are timed to particular seasonal events. So that's another thing, that things can change over time or seasonally. One important aspect is because species don't work in isolation, they interact with other things. If different species respond differently, that's going to cause what we often call an ecological mismatch. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. Or they can adapt. they can respond in a way that now they can either adjust or evolve to new conditions, or they can decline and go extinct. So let me spend a few minutes just talking about examples of each of these different responses, okay? Because we now know that if we look at climate change over the last 50 years, we see this whole range of different responses. It's not just a single thing, although some things are more common than others. Okay. All right, here's a really nice example from birds, and these are from, how many of you are birders? All right, great. So you contributed to some of these data. There's this wonderful thing called the Audubon Christmas bird count. It's been going on, I'm not even sure when it started, but these data are from starting in 1930, okay? It's basically people go out around the winter holidays and go to certain sites and record the birds that are there, and they do it every year all over the US and other places, and you get this wonderful long-term records, okay? So you can, these are data for a particular species, white-breasted nuthatch, which is not at all it's a quite abundant species, a widespread species. And what this map is looking at is how have the distribution of these nuthatches changed over this 90-year period based on the Audubon bird count. And these are year-long residents in these different places. And the dark, the sort of reddish color, I'm actually colorblind. So if I say a color wrong, just bear with me. Red and green are, interesting shades of gray. These dark reddish areas are areas where these birds used to be and are no longer there in sustained, consistent population. So these are areas that have all lost nuthatch abundance, okay? The area in the middle, this sort of intermediate color, whatever that is areas where they've been maintained throughout that whole time period. And these are areas where the distribution has expanded, okay? So it's obviously there's a shift from south to north in the overall range. So this is a classic example of range shift, okay? And there are lots and lots of examples of range shifts, okay? Of course, it requires that the resources that that species needs are also up here, okay? And that they can get there. And of course, there's lots of cases where that's not the situation. But this is a fairly generalist, both ecological and it's largely an insectivorous bird. Here's another example. So we see, and a pattern that we see very frequently is range expansions, not just shifts. And we're seeing this a lot in tropical and subtropical species that are moving into more temperate areas. So here are a couple of examples from the southern US that you're familiar with. You're certainly familiar with this, okay? This is fire ants, which have been moving north in their distribution over the last few decades, okay? Here's their kind of current distribution, and it cuts, of course, right through here in good old North Carolina. And this is the sort of potential infestation zone in the very near future. In fact, they're already in many of those areas. Okay? And fire ants are actually very much limited by minimum winter temperatures. So as minimum winter temperatures are increasing, there's a range expansion happening of fire ants, okay? This is a kind of a similar example with increases in the frequency and the movement upward of dengue fever, which is a viral disease, which is vectored by, that's transmitted by a particular kind of mosquitoes called Aedes. It's primarily one species of Aedes. So, and that increase is associated with increased primarily increased winter and spring temperatures here in the southeastern US, okay? Again, there are lots of examples of these, and in fact, we're seeing them very much in the sort of subtropical into temperate regions. So those are changes in space. Of course, one of the key effects of climate change in most areas is seasonal changes. Okay? This is a map of the US of temperature change over, again, about the last 50 years. Okay, so again, red is increased, blue is decreased. There's almost no blue anywhere here. But this is temperature during the spring months, March, April, May. Okay, and you can see that spring temperatures are much warmer than they used to be, and spring is coming early. I mean, we all know that. Most of you are interested in plants, and you can see that. Okay, and we now have really excellent long-term data on what that's doing in terms of bud burst and flowering in lots of plants. So here is some data for Europe and China and the US. And so basically this is looking again over about a 50-year period. This is the changes in seasonal timing. So 0 means there was no change in the date of bud burst for a particular species over this 50-year. And red means now it's happening earlier. Okay. And all you can see at a glance, there's a heck of a lot more red than there is blue. The vast majority of the plants are developing seasonally earlier than they used to. That's particularly true in Europe, which is at higher latitude, somewhat less true in the US, but that's still the overall pattern. Okay. And this is taking those sorts of data and saying, okay, well, has the season got earlier than it used to be? And this is in days per decade, okay? Or has it gotten later? Well, everything's gotten earlier. There's nothing above the 0 line here. But what this is meant to represent is that there's earlier seasonal timing for the vast majority of organisms, temperate organisms especially, but it varies between different sorts of organisms. So here we are, here's herbs and grasses, shrubs and trees. So there's been some change, for example, in most herbaceous plants. Okay, actually, there's been a much more dramatic seasonal advance in butterflies and in birds than there is on the resources. Okay, so that's a problem. Okay, and actually, interestingly, you see the biggest response has been in mammals. Okay, these are mostly small mammals. Okay, but if things are getting earlier, and caterpillars and birds are responding in terms of the plants, then these are now coming out too early relative to the plants. Okay, and so are the butterflies. But the birds and the butterfly, you can see the problem here. And this is what we call a temporal mismatch, the different species mismatch. That is, climate change is affecting different species, but it's affecting them in different ways. And that's altering their ecological interactions in really important ways. And so this is a very active area of research. Actually, there's probably 5 people I teach in the biology department at UNC, 5 people who study different aspects of this problem, of how climate change is altering the interactions among species. Okay. Let me just give you one example. Alan Hurlburt is a bird biologist in the department, and actually he's collaborating with some of these projects based here at the gardens. Okay, but he's interested in seasonal mismatch between migratory birds, which of course they're experiencing wintering temperatures in some completely other area, and anticipating when to fly up here based on the resources up here, which is changing at a different rate climatically. Okay. And then there's the local insect resources that the nesting birds are going to be using, and they're depending on the plants. Okay, so this is a large-scale project across the U.S. With a bunch of collaborators asking, how are these different ecological players shifting in response to climate, and how is that affecting their interactions? Okay, so there's a lot of interesting things, and I guess the short answer to that is actually many migratory birds are not responding in the same way that their resources are, and that's causing population declines. And there's a lot of variation among different birds, and migratory birds and non-migratory birds are actually responding in different ways. Okay, Alan could give 4 or 5 talks about that. Another kind of mismatch is what we might call a thermal mismatch, and that's the idea is you might have 2 species that interact that are in the same area. Okay, but their tolerance or response to temperature is different. And again, there's many different examples of this. Okay. one of the classic ones is corals and their algal symbionts. So, and of course, I'm sure you all know that coral reefs are really important to diversity in many tropical systems, near shore systems. And coral depend on these algal symbionts for resources, for basically for carbohydrates, okay? But the algae that are the algal symbionts in coral have a lower tolerance to heat than the coral animals themselves that create the coral, the reefs themselves, okay? And this coral bleaching is a phenomenon where at high temperatures, it's not clear whether the coral expels the algae or the algae die or they leave or some combination of those. It probably varies, but you get this important bleaching phenomenon that's, it's increased very dramatically in response to heat waves, especially in the Caribbean, but also in Australia and other reef areas. Again, during the last 30, 40 years or so. Okay. Actually, a system that I study in my lab is one where we study tobacco hornworms. I don't know if you know what they are. They eat your tomatoes and your peppers and all those good things. Their major natural enemy is a parasitoid wasp that attacks the caterpillars. If you've ever found a hornworm with little tiny white things on its back, those are actually those are good guys. They kill the caterpillar. And the parasitoid has a virus that lives inside of it that controls the wasp. And the virus is more sensitive to heat than the wasp and the caterpillar, and it causes all kinds of crazy stuff. So just an example of how these sort of thermal mismatches cause actually quite surprising ecological consequences. Okay, and I'll mention briefly, I'm going too long, but that's okay. Another kind of response is to adapt. And in fact, one of the things that we've learned is that for some species, they're able to evolve quite readily over year to decade timescales to adapt to these new conditions. And I'm just showing you, this has been shown now in birds, that birds have actually evolved to migrate earlier. So they're not just responding to local cues, but they actually have evolved to change that. There's many examples of evolution of smaller body size as temperature warms, changes in butterfly coloration. So these are all examples of how things actually adapt evolutionarily to climate change. The problem is that the majority, the things that are most likely to evolve are things that have large populations and they're generalists and they're widely distributed and they can move around. Basically, many of the things that are of conservation interest have no possibility of evolving. And in fact, the things most likely to evolve are pests. Okay, that's not usually what we want. Okay, all right. And of course, the other option is decline and extinction. And I'm sure you've seen many examples where you can talk about. Well, this is. There's a paper that came out a couple of years ago called about insect apocalypse. Probably some of you have heard about the insect apocalypse. And this is, again, a long-term study primarily in Europe, Northern Europe, looking at insect declines in diversity and abundance. And what was most sobering about this study is these were studies done in natural reserves. These were not due to habitat change or agriculture or anything else like that. So they were changes that were directly due to other things, and climate was certainly one of the biggest culprits. Okay. Let me give you one or two other examples, because I want to come back to the climate niche. So here's some examples. Actually, let me just talk about humans. Well, I'll ask it. You want to talk, who wants to talk about trees? And who wants to talk about humans? How many people vote for trees? How many people vote for humans? Okay, humans win. Darn, we always win. That's the problem. But we're so interesting. How can you not want to do that? Okay. So if we continue with our sort of climate business as usual model, this is what the climate will look like, the mean annual temperatures will look like at the end of the century. Okay. And so this is now the mean annual temperatures. These black areas are things that are even off of here. Okay. Remember how I said that humans don't occur above 29 degrees? Okay. So that means that many areas where humans are currently, this whole area through here, okay, is no longer going to be suitable for humans. Living in any sort of outdoor situation, and we can create our own worlds. Okay. And so these are predictions asking, here's the current distribution of where humans live and the sort of suitability, climatic suitability for them. Okay. This is what it'll look like actually just in 40 years from now. This is the change in suitability. And so I think the thing to focus on here is red means that things are going to become much less suitable for humans across this entire band across the tropics. Okay. There are some green areas there, Canada, Siberia, some places like that are going to get, those will become more suitable. So if you're interested in real estate, you might consider that. So let me so I've already talked some about who are likely to be winners and losers in this. Okay. What I'd like to come back to is, okay, so let's spend the last 5 minutes talking about, okay, where are we? Okay. And how likely are these different outcomes to occur? Okay. And I'm actually more optimistic now, probably naively so, than I was 2 years ago. Okay. And there's a couple of things that have happened in recent years. Okay. One that I've mentioned already is the Paris Agreement, which was an international agreement about climate change. Basically, this is where things were. This is like pre-industrial average temperature. We've already warmed over 2 degrees Fahrenheit, okay, just by 2020. This is if everybody did exactly what they said with the Paris Agreement, that's not going to happen. Okay, well, unless the world changes. But there's a range of other possible outcomes and targets. Okay, and in fact, there is, within the, basically what we're looking at here is different levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, depending on what we do, okay, based on current policies, the pledges and targets in the Paris Agreement, and projected warming. So the business as usual model is probably unlikely to happen now. We are actually starting to do some things, okay, but there's still a wide range of outcomes, okay. And there's actually a number of valuable things in the climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act last year that have been or are being implemented. Okay, I'm just going to finish with one last thing, which I think this is also a pretty striking graphic or two. Okay, this is how this ties back to what I was talking about mammals before. This is the greenhouse emissions in different animal protein. And what's plotted on here, it's a graphic from some last year. This is the relative nutritional value for different animal proteins. So this is like the average for all protein sources, animal protein sources. This is the average for greenhouse gas emissions per unit protein. Okay. And the thing to see here, you can see that most of the seafood is over here. Here's chicken, here's pork, there's beef. Beef is way outsized in terms of its greenhouse gas efficiency. That's not even taking into account its impacts on land use and a million other things that are happening. This is just through things that are impacting climate per chain, per se. Okay. And I think that's pretty telling. Okay. So in terms of what can we do, I mean, again, this is the topic of many, many seminars, but you know, these are points that that I'll point out. You know, many of these you already know. Okay, but actually, I think two things that maybe are more, you know, tailored to this audience and this topic is, one is the importance as forests as carbon stores, because we saw the sort of impacts that this is likely to have on boreal forests and tropical rainforests going forward in future. And a second is switching to more emissions efficient protein sources. I mean, we can also see the many other impacts, not just about climate. This is just a list that has to do with climate. Okay. So I wanted to just sort of end the difference between here and here, that's based on what we do. Okay. So the climate has already changed. It's changed a lot. It's going to continue changing regardless of what we do, but we actually have a lot of agency here collectively. So thanks, and sorry for going a little over, and I'll take any questions.
Great, thank you, Joel. So for folks on Zoom, please put your questions in the Q&A tool, and David will help moderate that for us, and I'll ask if there are any questions in the room. Let me make it to you first.
I have a question and a comment. My comment is that looks like regulation can really work if you look at chlorofluorocarbons and the regulation of those. Our ozone layer is building up again. So, I mean, there's evidence that regulations can help. And I hope there are more of those. And my question is about the Piedmont flora that we have here, and its hopeful genetic memory of what drier, hotter times were in the past, like in the hypsothermal 2.5 to 9,000 years ago. It was really hot and dry. So I haven't seen many studies looking at that kind of genetic memory where genes might be turned on that have lain dormant for thousands of years that might get turned on when it gets hotter. Do you know of any studies like this?
Yeah, let me start with a comment and then the other one. I mean, you're right that regulation can be very effective. I mean, I think one of the challenges with climate change has been that the response, one, it's not just one thing, it's a lot of different things. So we could reduce ozone and only impact a relatively small fraction of the economy, okay, as opposed to major changes in lifestyle. And the responses were fairly quick. Okay, if we change things right now, we're not going to see their climatic consequences for decades, and that's not kind of how people think. So I think that's a challenge. Well, and it's partly, I'd have to say, you know, when I started working on this in 1990, I had this very naive thinking that if we just collect the data and present it to people, then we'll be all set. And I thought by the year 2000 that that's kind of where we were. And obviously I was completely wrong. That's why I'm a scientist and not a public policy person. For the other part, it was warmer there have been warm periods, but none of them are projected to be as warm as what we're going to be seeing. The Southeast has been really interesting. It's sometimes called a climate hole. I don't know if you've heard that term, but basically there's been less warming in the Southeast than I think any other part of North America, okay? And it's not fully understood why that is the case. It's a really interesting question. It's not predicted to continue, okay? We had our good times. We'll be catching up with, although we will continue to warm more slowly than everything to the north of us. Okay, so that will continue to be a big change. Okay, I mean, climate memory. So I work on insects, so they have one to many generations a year typically. 10,000, 20,000 years is a very, very long time. Mature forest species, that's a whole different thing. So there may be, I think about it more in terms of genetic variation that's still out there that may be available for selection to act on to allow them to adapt. Okay, so I don't know of anything like that for long-lived trees because it's so darn hard to study. Okay, I don't know. There's no evidence of that sort of effect in insects, but of course, at the larger scale, evolution of new functions or to new conditions is happening all the time. Okay, again, rapid, high things that have high reproductive rates and large populations like pests, those are the ones that are most likely to appear in. So for things of conservation interest, I'm not at all optimistic on that. Yeah.
We have a question from the Zoom audience.
Yeah, we've had a couple of back-to-back questions about the role of native plants and what that might look like in the future. So one common claim for the importance of native species is that locally evolved plants support locally evolved insects, which support locally evolved birds. But if the timelines of each species is shifting differently, is there a need to support the search for potentially non-local congeners that are a better phenological match for these species of concerns rather than focus purely on native plants?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And the whole idea of the word native can be used at different levels. And there are people who are more expert than I on this in the audience. But so we know that just the climate here 18,000 years ago was really different than it is now. So when we're thinking about current associations between plants and insects and birds like that, those have also been shifting over time. Okay. And in fact, certainly in those cases, that is part of the evolutionary history of those species. Okay. What's different now is both the continued direction and rate of change. Okay, that's where we're kind of in unprecedented territory, especially at the warm end. Okay. At the cold end, sometimes we've gotten quite dramatic drops in temperature, but the rises have tended to be more gradual than certainly than what we're seeing now. Okay, I mean the idea of using congeners as sort of equivalents as things get reassorted. I think it's, you can do that in kind of an case-by-case basis if you have a species of conservation interest. Okay, I mean, actually, I was just talking this morning with a biologist at Michigan State who's interested in an endangered butterfly called the Mitchell satyr butterfly, which occurs in actually in the Great Lakes area, but only a few populations. It's a very close relative to the St. Francis satyr, which is also a conservation interest here in North Carolina. Okay, and exactly the same question. They both feed on some similar array of host plants. So to what extent can we use St. Francis as something that will tell us information about what Michigan might be like at the end of the century? Okay, so actually there's some really interesting things there, but I think those are cases where we need to know more at a case-by-case level than birds and insects. They're too heterogeneous in their responses.
You have another question on Zoom, David?
Hard one. Is there a certain point of no return for climate change where there will no longer be an ability to pump the brakes to warm at a slower rate? Or is there always a way to sort of lessen the increase?
I don't know. Do we have brakes? Yeah, I guess we have brakes. A point of no return. So people are often talking about that. There are some sort of critical transitions. Okay, one of the critical transitions that people are worried about, and it's actually a reason we've underestimated the changes so far, has been how rapidly the ice sheets, especially at the north, around the North Pole and northern regions, have been melting. Okay, and that causes a feedback loop between the ice melts, there's less reflection off the surface, that radiation gets absorbed, that makes it hotter, the ice melts faster. So that's a positive feedback loop, which is accelerating climate change. There's a lot of worries about how that's going to affect circulation systems, ocean circulation in the North Atlantic, that has huge impacts on the kinds of changes that has huge impacts on seasonal and regional climate. This crazy atmospheric rivers in California and the Northwest this past winter, those are things that weren't, the predictions, we're still at the case where we expect more extreme precipitation and extreme heat events, but making that kind of prediction is right at kind of the level of where we are right now. So I guess that's a meandering response to, yes, it is possible, okay? There's nothing in our current climate understanding that says, well, at this point we should just give up, okay? Because there are things that we can do that can have very big effects, okay? Certainly at a global level, some regions may be much more impacted by these sorts of effects than others. So, I think there's something.
Yeah, it's a question / comment. One, was a slide about like the winners, and you had said something about agriculture in Canada. Is that strictly climate based? Is the reason you put that down, or is there like more reasons to that? And then the other one was you had said something about picking more nutrient dense like meat production, and I was curious kind of as to why instead of the methods we're using to produce it, because cattle raised on grass is more nutrient dense and produces less overall gas, like greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm kind of curious why you said that as well.
Okay, great. Both good comments and questions, because I kind of zipped through some stuff there. Yes, the agriculture, I mean, that was like, Canada's a big place, right? Yes, but that prediction was specifically, if we think about climate change by itself, okay, what regions will now be more favorable for agriculture? And much of central part of Canada and the big chunk of Russia will become more favorable for agriculture than they are currently. Now that may reduce boreal forests, that has effects on carbon sequestration. So, that's not necessarily a good thing. It's just something that emerges from that directly. And what was your second really good question? Cattle. Okay. Yes. So thank you. So the way those calculations were done is to say, let's look at how cattle are currently produced in general, okay, and look at the greenhouse emissions that emerge from those. That's how that point came about. So if we changed our methods, those methods by themselves could become much more greenhouse gas efficient, okay? That's kind of taking what we're doing now and using that as a projection. So thank you. Yeah, there's a lot. In many of these predictions, there are assumptions about what we're doing and what go into those predictions that we have to understand.
Great. Well, I think we are out of time today. Thank you so much, Joel. And thank you all for joining us today. And look forward to seeing you all soon. Enjoy your time in the garden. Thank you so much.